I'm very happy to introduce Ariane Fennetaux, an École Normale Supérieure and Courtauld Institute alumna. Dr. Ariane Fennetaux is Associate Professor at the Université of Paris in France. Her research focuses on material culture with a particular emphasis on textile and dress in the long 18th century. She has edited several volumes, including The Afterlife of Youth Things, Recycling in the Long 18th Century, published by Routledge. Her book, The Pocket, A Hidden History of Women's Lives, 1660 until 19, co-authored with Barbara Berman, was published in May 2019 by Yale University Press. She is currently working on global networks of textile trade and industrial espionage, and is directing with John Stiles a critical facsimile edition of John's Holker book of samples kept in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, to be published in 2020. At the crossroads of dress history, environmental history, and animal studies, her new project looks at the use of animal products in fashion over the 17th and 19th century period. And today, Ariane will talk about her last book, The Pocket, A Hidden History of Women's Lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to the bar to be able to present my research. The 19th century nursery rhyme, Lucy Locket lost a pocket, is perhaps the only shared memory of the otherwise mostly forgotten object I will be discussing today. Yet, every day, between the late 17th and the late 19th centuries, women and girls of all social classes wore detachable pockets like Lucy's. They tied them around their waist, independently of their clothing, reached them through openings in their petticoats and dresses, and put them on and off at will. Pockets may seem obscure now, but when restored to attention, then they open up a rich nexus of historical questions, ranging from women's domesticity and work to agency, from possession to financial independence, and from consumer practices to privacy. Far from being insignificant, therefore, they actually offer a disconcertingly fruitful insight into women's lives in the past. In his milestone book, In Small Things Forgotten, James Dietz draws attention to the wealth of information and meaning contained in small things for the historian. It is terribly important that the small things forgotten be remembered, for in the seemingly little and insignificant things that accumulate to create a lifetime, the essence of existence is captured. We must remember these bits and pieces, and we must use them in new and imaginative ways so that a different appreciation for what life is today and was in the past can be achieved. The written document has its proper and important place, but there is also a time when we should set aside a perusal of diaries, court records, and inventories, and listen to another voice. Dietz thus makes a double call to remember and study small things and to use them as sources for historical inquiry. The book my presentation is based on today tries to do both. Jointly written with Barbara Berman and published this year, 5 months ago actually, by Yale University Press, The Pocket, A Hidden History of Women's Lives, focuses on a small, seemingly unimportant object to recontextualize it as a culturally and socially embedded artifact that can bring an important contribution to our understanding of women's relationship to possessions, consumption, mobility, work, sociability, or privacy. So our contention is that objects matter to the writing of history, and that they specifically matter if you intend to delve into women's past at a time when traditional literacy was a male rather than a female preserve, when only a minority of women could read and write, but all wore pockets, whether they be a duchess, an innkeeper, or a potato seller, and all could more or less aptly, hold and use a needle, objects may provide not just an alternative, but an imperative source to the writing of history. Our other contention is that a small thing, something that is marginal and hidden, can open up big historical questions. Pockets are seemingly inconsequential and trifle on various counts. They're utilitarian, everyday, commonplace, textile, female. So they score pretty low in the hierarchy of noble or important historical questions. Yet, we argue that pockets are worth studying not just despite their smallness, but precisely because of their smallness. There is a specific heuristic power to smallness, because by refocusing or by forcing the gaze to refocus, it recalibrates our vision, asks different questions, and hopefully gives different answers. And I guess I'm not going to run you through the whole book, but I'll try to give you an impression of what we're trying to do. Rather typically, women's pockets were so much part of the everyday experience of women of the period that they have left relatively few traces in the sources traditionally used by historians. Often handmade and of little value, they are seldom listed in merchants' ledgers, probate inventories, or wills, although sometimes they do appear, and I'm just giving you a few examples from our sources. As they were usually worn under the skirt, they only make discrete appearances in paintings and engravings, whereas their being part of the fabric of the everyday means that they are seldom dwelled on or described in texts, whether they be published or private. So that carrying out a social and cultural history of pockets requires one draws on all of these sources, however needle in a haystack the endeavor might sometimes be, as well as on court cases, which are especially important to shed light on the women who left no written record, no account books, no diary, the humbler women, as they shed light obviously on what they had in their pockets when they got attacked, but also on all the practices around their pocket, how they safeguarded the contents of their pockets, how they organized the contents of their pockets. Whilst the body of 390 extant pockets we studied in about 30 UK collections, both private and public, and this is just a very small sample that could fit on the screen, form an irreplaceable body of evidence whose testimony the book foregrounds. One of the criticisms made by historians to people working with objects is that items that have been collected are socially unrepresentative, fine specimens being more likely to be preserved than mundane ones. If this is true of some of the collections, such as those of the Victoria and Albert Museum, for instance, whose acquisition policy has very much been historically driven by the idea of preserving fine specimens of fine workmanship, other collections, on the contrary, have been purposely constructed around the idea of preserving plebeian heritage. Many of their pockets are made in hard-wearing materials, whereas the workmanship is sometimes crude, and they exhibit signs of wear that testify to the work they did for their owners. It is our contention that, therefore, that in its extent and diversity, our survey registers evidence that cannot easily be garnered from other sources, and that this testimony is especially important at a time when material literacy was much more widespread than textual literacy. The first lesson that is learned from a material archive has to do with the chronology of the object, which, unlike what fashion historians had thought, was not replaced by reticules at the end of the 18th century when women started wearing high-waisted muslin gowns. This misconception had derived from looking at fashion prints and newspaper articles published at the time, which often pitted the old-fashioned pocket against the new modern reticule, and I'm just giving you a few of the literature that kind of has this discourse. Yet, as evidenced by many dated examples in the survey, as well as by some pockets using easily datable technologies such as machine stitching or metal fastening systems, these were premature obituaries for the pocket, which in reality adapted and continued being worn even with those streamlined dresses. And this is a print dating from 1800, where you can see the muslin gown and you can see the woman on the left-hand side with a pocket. You can see another woman has lost her pockets on the ground. And there's other evidence, there's material evidence, print evidence with the pocket hole, for instance, through which the woman has looked up a dress. And you can see when you look at some of the pockets that the shape adapted and the where it was worn would have adapted, but they continued to wear them. Beyond merely redressing a faulty timeline, the very persistence of pockets, despite the fashionable reticule and then the new integrated pocket, or then later the handbag, shows sartorial choices and consumption not to be all governed by a desire to shine or emulate, pointing to a fundamental difference between dress and fashion, which is something we're discussing today in the Scholars' Morning this morning, the Scholars' Tour this morning, as pockets were an essentially unfashionable accessory. And we really think this is an important element to understand this. We don't really like the term accessory either, because accessory means marginal, but it's an element of dress that is unfashionable and persists for 200 years, despite being called incessantly in newspapers unfashionable. With specimens often measuring over 40 centimeters in length, sometimes up to 60 centimeters, this is the big mammoth pockets, the biggest pockets we have, and routinely being 30 centimeters in width, our survey of surviving pockets illustrate one very pragmatic reason they might have persisted. They were extremely practical and capacious, something which the shoplifters' trials illustrate in sometimes baffling ways. Sarah Gladman, in 1806, had thus managed to stuff in her extreme large pockets 25 yards of gingham and 50 yards of printed cotton, whilst Phoebe Morris had made off with 40 potatoes in her pockets in 1839, and Jane Griffiths, a farmhand, took her chances in 1777 with 2 live ducks in hers. Capaciousness did not just serve criminals. When a lady was attacked on Barnes Common in London in 1754, her pockets contained, among other things, a small round tortoiseshell snuff box, a London almanac in a black shagreen case, an ivory carved toothpick case, a silver sliding pencil, a white cornelian seal, a tortoiseshell comb in a case, a silver thimble and bodkin, a bunch of keys, a red leather pocketbook, a green knit purse containing half a guinea, a crown piece of William and Mary, and about 5 shillings with 2 glass-smelling bottles. The raw call of near on 15 objects, all carried in the pocket by the well-to-do woman, illustrates the host of pocket-sized objects which the consumer society produced specifically for the pocket, both male and female, obviously. In an age of expanding consumption, the small space of the pocket was indeed the focus of an ever-encroaching marketplace that produced innumerable pocket accessories enabling to carry and keep at hand the wherewithal of polite sociability in miniature form. The commodification of the pocket did not escape commentators like Adam Smith, who in the Theory of Moral Sentiment in 1759 wrote how many people ruin themselves by laying out money on trinkets of frivolous utility. All their pockets are stuffed with little conveniences. They contrive new pockets unknown in the clothes of other people in order to carry a greater number, whilst others targeted specifically women for stuffing their pockets with useless trinkets, and obviously that went along with the idea of women as consumers. Yet, despite the contemporary commentary about women emptying their husbands' pockets to fill theirs with useless knickknacks, our sources reveal contents were often much more modest than that extraordinary loss that the woman 54 sustained. Almost contemporary with that woman, with the attack on Barnes Common, another woman was attacked in 1753 in London. she lost 1 ticking pocket, value 1 penny, 1 iron key, value 2 pence, 1 pen knife, value 1 penny, 1 brass thimble, value 1 halfpenny. The things in a pocket may have been modest, but they could be rich and varied in meanings. If a key suggests independence and security, a penknife is an indication of potential literacy and education, whilst a brass thimble could hold the promise of wage labor, indicate a well-kept household, whilst also having strong personal associations, thimbles being often given as love or friendship tokens, so that the contents of a woman's pockets, whether ample or meager, are more than a yardstick of plenty or want, luxury and necessity. The inside of a woman's pocket, once glimpsed, is a suggestive place, a miniature cosmos that can tell us how a woman could own, use, and think about material things, an index also to how she saw and imagined herself. In a context where privacy was a privilege enjoyed by few, pockets also afforded women a space they could hope to call their own, and where they could enjoy at least a modicum of privacy, although this was always fragile and contested, as we are reminded by a domestic drama that unfolded in August 1770 in a London lodging house. One of the lodgers, Elizabeth Warner, an unmarried former servant, was charged with killing her newborn baby daughter in the house. Suspected by the landlady of having given birth, Elizabeth at first prevaricated, no doubt in dread of a possible charge of the capital crime of infanticide, but then confessed to an early miscarriage in the privy. Mrs. Smith, the midwife, was called to the house to investigate the goings-on. She describes the search. There was a box, locked. I asked her for the key. She would not let me have it till I threatened to break the box open. I opened the box and found a parcel of dirty things. I found the afterbirth in a leather pocket. I looked farther and found the child wrapped up in one of the prisoner's shifts and petticoats, dead. Elizabeth's sad tale of loss and fear manifests how it was to her leather pocket that Elizabeth entrusted her safety and privacy when, in extremis, she bundled into it the evidence from her own body. The role of pockets as guardians of women's desires, hopes, and secrets is repeatedly illustrated in sources, but as objects, pockets themselves materialize protection with their womb-like shape and their inner compartments and private pockets, sometimes structuring their contents. In this respect also, by defining an inside and an outside, the embroidered floral motifs that circle the opening of many 18th century pockets give material expression to the guardianship of this protected space and its contents by the wearer/maker, implementing a specifically female technology of containment, which anthropologists remind us is always also a technology of the self. A small pocket in a private collection gives potent shape to this, embroidered as it is in human hair, with small hearts on either side of its opening. It was made by an inmate of the Duke Street prison in Glasgow and given to the governor's wife in 1851. Embroidered in hair with the full name of its maker, Margaret Diaz, the hearts and the motto "Forget Me Not," this object gives poignant expression to pockets as manifestations of personal identity and the possibility of privacy, especially given the context of close confinement in which this object was made. But pockets didn't need to carry the DNA of their makers to become strong carriers of identity. Whether emblazoned at the front or more discreetly integrated into its decorative pattern, many pockets carry the name or initials of their owners, whilst others that may first appear plain and unremarkable, when looked at closely, can start to divulge a number of details, each fragmentary, but collectively building a more rounded picture of the pocket's significance to its owner. The toil of many plebeian women can be read in the signs of wear, tear, and strain, borne by many pockets. At the same time, the darns and repairs and traces of recycling on the surviving artifacts manifest women's practical tactics to make things last. Plebeian women applied their skills and cunning in order to extend the life cycle of objects that were essential to their existence by clever or crude reinforcements and mending. Jane Thomas was going to market to sell her husband's produce in Wales in the second half of the 19th century wearing these pockets. The acquisition files tells us. The backs of her pockets, like a palimpsest, embody her preservation strategies for these utilitarian but companionate objects, worked to bits and patched to within an inch of their lives. Her pockets register her unrelenting efforts to prolong their usefulness, but also the amount of care and work that went into preserving these evidently much-loved objects. This material bricolage that is visible on extant pockets is often resourceful and creative. These women may or may not have been literate, but like Lévi-Strauss's bricoleur, they can be said to speak not only with things, but also through the medium of things. A group of 5 pockets, all coming from the same household, illustrates how the particularity of a stitch or of a patch can act as signature. Despite their subtle differences, they share a similar rhetoric of mending of sorts. And in the kinship of their patches, what can be read is the singularity of a hand, a unique presence. Whoever made and repaired these pockets is unknown to us, but for these very pockets that have survived. Yet, in the stratigraphy of patches visible on them, the woman undeniably has left a mark. Looked closely, the stitches and patches on pockets thus illuminate what those women meant when in court trials they said repeatedly they could recognize their own work, or indeed their own mending, on stolen items. In 1794, Elizabeth Hord, whose house had been broken into, could positively swear to a pair of pockets saying, "They are mine, they are patchwork of my own doing," while Mary Butler recognized her things, telling the court in 1797, these things are all my property. Here is an apron of my own mending. I have no doubt that they are all mine." Women's hands-on engagement with the material nurtured a specific relationship to objects, where the smallest detail of construction in something they had made, the peculiarity of a stitch, became meaningful carriers not only of identification, but also of identity. The intimate bond fostered by making or repairing things that such words evoke is difficult to grasp for the historian. In the absence of words, surviving objects might be the only source which registers something of this bond, and, in the case of less privileged women, something of the existence of those who left no written record behind. So to conclude, I would like to go back to Diet's call not to forget small things, and in a way to Margaret Dear's pocket, forget me not. An initial, a stitch, a stain, a knot, the marks of strain and pull in particular places, the grime, the wear, the efforts deployed to repair, a crease mark, a hole, a ninked number, all these little things have big stories to tell if you care to listen.